In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
I do want to talk about your new book, which I'm enjoying. I apologize, I have not finished it yet. Haven't had much time for reading. I think I'm up to chapter 5. So you're going to have to fill me in on some things without spoiling the end. Okay.
Sure.
But the name of the book is Letter to Bob Avakian.
Yes.
And a lot of our viewers might not be familiar with Bob Avakian. Can you tell us who he was and why you wrote him this letter?
Well, communism is kind of a fringe view in America. But recently, in the last decade or so, there's been a much bigger increase in people that are interested in it. And the leader of one of the most visible communist groups in America that is very out there. They have a chain of bookstores. They sell their newspaper a lot. They're very visible in your face in the name of communism. It's called the Revolutionary Communist Party. And the leader is a guy named Bob Avakian, who was a leader of Students for a Democratic Society back in the day, was a Bay Area activist, and he's formed this communist group. And his organization is neutral on Ukraine. They're neutral. They neither Washington nor Moscow. They kind of tend to blame Russia for it, but they're critical. They don't want to escalate to World War III. And so I decided that I would write this book because as so many younger people are getting interested in communism, he is going to be one of the people they come across. The group makes a really big point of promoting him on a personal level. They talk about building a culture of appreciation for their leader, Bob Avakian. So they promote his writings, his speeches, etc. So I thought that by writing this book, I could be a part of that conversation too. And I could, praise his accomplishments and what he's achieved over the years, because he has done quite a few admirable things, but also point out why his ideology and his worldview that kind of puts him as neutral between Russia and China and the United States. I don't think that's correct. And I also had the opportunity to reveal, some information about him that was presented to me, namely that he is an asset of French intelligence, which is kind of the big bombshell in the book, as well as the fact that during the late 1970s, his organization was heavily infiltrated by the FBI. And it was used to kind of intimidate Jimmy Carter against setting and establishing diplomatic relations with China. And both of those revelations that are well documented are quite important to point out, especially in light of everything that's been going on in Africa in regards to France, losing control of various African countries, in regards to NATO, et cetera, as well as, when we talk about, divisions in the American ruling class about foreign policy, et cetera, and infiltration of various organizations. So the book covers a lot of ground, and it's not a hit piece. I didn't write this to tear him down or destroy him. And I spend probably the first couple chapters, as you read, praising him and his accomplishments. This is an 80-year-old man who's done a lot of good things in his life, and he's held a group of people together. Back in the 70s, many different communist organizations were formed, and most of them dissolved after a decade or so. His group is still here, so that's admirable. And, they've done a lot to support Mumia Abu-Jamal to prevent his execution, a lot to raise the issue of police brutality when it was certainly not a trendy issue to talk about. Now it's pretty widely discussed, but it wasn't in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s. So he deserves recognition for that. But also, if he's a genuine communist, he should be supporting Russia and China right now. He should be supporting the people of the world rejecting the domination of the United States. And he shouldn't be, taking orders from the French imperialists, which seems to be the case. And I make a pretty strong case for that in the book.
Yes, you do. And I'm curious because you talk about this a lot on your live streams, how the FBI infiltrated, was it back in the 50s or 60s, the Communist Party of the United States, the CPUSA. And also, you talk about that a lot in your book, how they infiltrated Bob Avakian's group. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how they did it and why they did it?
Well, the FBI had this program that is now widely discussed because of the Black Lives Matter thing. People now talk about COINTELPRO. But what does COINTELPRO stand for? Right? It stands for Counter intelligence program. And the reason that black activists like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Fred Hampton and Malcolm X were targeted in COINTELPRO, the same program that targeted the communist groups, was because the position of J. Edgar Hoover as the director of the FBI was that the civil rights movement and the black freedom struggle and the various communist groups and the peace movement, he considered that to be a foreign intelligence operation. He considered that to be a conspiracy from Russia and from China. And so on those grounds, he sent the FBI to viciously go after the Communist Party, the Black Panthers, Students for a Democratic Society, peace groups, etc. And that was one of the main activities of the FBI. And, in the late 70s, when Jimmy Carter was president, you had the Church Committee, which was almost kind of like a Truth and Reconciliation for the 1960s, in which they admitted in congressional record and had congressional hearings admitting to all of this behavior of the COINTELPRO program that went on. Now, in regards to the Communist Party of the United States, in 1948, the National Board of the Communist Party was prosecuted. It was 20 people that were members of the Communist Party's National Board, and they were prosecuted under federal law for conspiring to not to violently overthrow the American government, but to teach an ideology that would necessitate and lead one to the conclusion that you should overthrow the government. And the language of the law that was used, it's called the Smith Act, which was a law that was passed in 1940. They didn't have to actually prove that they'd ever talked about overthrowing the government. All they had to prove was that they had taught an ideology, communism, which could lead one to that conclusion. So it was a particularly ridiculous conviction.
It was.
They were sent to prison for basically things that Marx and Lenin said. That was what the prosecution
They were like the January 6th protesters of their time, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, and the CNN actually made that analogy after January 6th. They argued January 6th. Yeah, they wrote an article comparing the trial of the Communist Party in 1948 to January 6th, which is just outrageous.
Wow.
But yeah, so the National Board of the Communist Party was thrown in jail. And then many states around the country had criminal communism or criminal syndicalism laws that outlawed the Communist Party. And so the Communist Party was basically forced to become an underground organization from about 1948 until 1957. However, they were underground and they were functioning in secret and, et cetera. But during those years, they still managed to do some pretty amazing things, like the Henry Wallace presidential campaign of 1948. I mean, the Communist Party was outlawed and suppressed, but they still managed to staff and organize a major presidential campaign that split the Democratic vote in 1948. And they organized something called the Civil Rights Congress, which was a legal organization that fought for the rights of black people. The Department of Justice labeled the Civil Rights Congress a communist front organization. The Civil Rights Congress wasn't able to put up bail for anyone who was charged because they got this label on them, but they still functioned and had protests for black freedom. A member of the Communist Party, William L. Patterson, was brought to the United Nations by the Soviet Union to present a petition accusing the American government of genocide against black people. And so even though they were an illegal organization and they were functioning in the shadows, they managed to do a lot to talk about civil rights, to organize peace marches and oppose the Cold War, even though the FBI was chasing them around, and anyone who publicly got up and said, I'm a member of the Communist Party, was being prosecuted. But then we all know that Stalin died.
53, right? 1953
yes.
is when he died.
Stalin died. And there was some confusion in the Soviet Union about who was going to come later. But then in 1956, Khrushchev got up at the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And basically, it was clear he was going to be the new leader. And he gave a tirade against Stalin, the infamous secret speech, much of which has been debunked. Some of the stuff is so ridiculous at the time that people at the time even said this is silly. Like one of the claims was that Stalin was so scared when Hitler had invaded that he started crying and hid under his desk in fear. And it's like, anyone who knows anything about Stalin knows that's ridiculous. Stalin was a bank robber at one point. This is a guy who would walk into banks with a firearm and rob people at gunpoint. So you think he hears about an army thousands of miles away and he just breaks down. I mean, that's ridiculous, and that a lot of the things Khrushchev said just didn't have any factual basis. But regardless, that was Khrushchev sending a message to the United States that this guy who came before me, Stalin, he was a hardliner. He was going to challenge you, but I'll negotiate with you, right? I'll compromise. And there was a feeling among the American government that they did want to negotiate with Khrushchev and that they were more worried about Mao and the African revolutionary movements. They were more concerned about these radicals around the world that were getting Soviet support to fight the American government. And they were hoping that they could convince Khrushchev that if the USA would get friendlier with the Soviet Union, he would de-escalate some of the support to these, third world communist revolutionary movements. He would maybe get China to back down on some issues. So the attitude was, Stalin, he's gone, but this new guy we can possibly work with. And so then in 1956, right after the secret speech, the Communist Party of the United States suddenly had a public meeting. For the first time in decades, they had a public event, a national committee meeting, where they announced that the secret speech was indeed real. And then they published a document called Communists Take a New Look, announcing that they were going to have a convention, a public convention in 2 years to decide whether or not they would drop communism completely and just become a mass party of socialism, dissolve or whatnot. Then, shortly after that public meeting happened, then the U.S. Supreme Court legalized the Communist Party with the Yates versus the United States ruling, where
Very
this guy,
important.
this guy who'd been a member of the Communist Party, his name was Yates, I think Dennis Yates, something like that. And he'd been a member of the Communist Party, but he proved in court, even though he was a member of the Communist Party, he had never advocated the violent overthrow of the government. And he said, look, just because I join a group that doesn't advocate the overthrow of the government, that doesn't mean I should go to jail for advocating the overthrow of the government. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, actually, as long as the Communist Party doesn't advocate the violent overthrow of the government, they're allowed to exist. So the Supreme Court then legalized the Communist Party. Well, that was clearly done as a gesture to Khrushchev. It was a gesture to Khrushchev. You're allowed to exist. You can exist, but ever since then, when they came back into existence, and then in 1958, they had their convention where they endorsed Khrushchev and his condemnations of Stalin. At that convention, and since then, the Communist Party has been a very small organization, less than 2,000 members. And at this point, I mean, it's a couple hundred at most. But when they came back into existence, legally speaking, from 1956 onward, they were doing so under the direction of the FBI. And in fact, there was a member there was a guy who was on the national board of the Communist Party. His name was Morris Childs. And Morris Childs was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Ronald Reagan for being an FBI informant and going back and forth to Moscow and bringing suitcases full of money back from Moscow to fund the Communist Party's activities and directing a network of informants that managed the Communist Party's affairs. So really, from about 1956 onward, the Communist Party has been more or less under the control of the FBI. That's not saying every person in it is an agent or something like that. That's not at all. It just means that their coming into existence as an organization was done with a U.S. federal agency saying, you're allowed to do this, but we're going to monitor your every move. We're going to make sure you do this and you don't do this. And that explains why the Communist Party has not really grown over the years, because if at any point they were to start growing and having an impact, the people, the federal agency that is overseeing them would step in and make sure that's not the case. And you can read about.
Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that the rank and file, the members of this Communist Party of the United States, were aware of the FBI infiltration, or were they unaware of the power that the FBI was exerting over their organization?
Oh, they were unaware. Absolutely. They were not told. But Morris Childs, who was on the national board, who knew Gus Hall, he knew all the leaders. He was an FBI informant, and he was regularly checking in with the FBI. Wow. And that there were mechanisms in place to make sure that the Communist Party never became an effective political organization. So much so
they were effectively neutered
yes.
During the Cold War. And when did they become aware of this infiltration?
I mean, I think they knew about it all along. I mean, they understood that. And my understanding is when they became a legal organization, once again, 1956, before the Yates ruling, which is interesting. But around that time, it was a matter of FBI agents going to the Communist Party members who had gotten out of jail and saying to them, okay, we've decided you can operate now, but you can have your office on this street. And it was almost like they were basically being told, okay, we've changed the rules. You're allowed to exist, but we're going to monitor what you do. And many of them were still on parole at that point. You have to remember, they had gone to federal prison for some of them 4 or 5 years, and they were all still kind of on parole. They weren't even really allowed to talk to each other, but they all apparently got a visit from the FBI that said, we've changed the rules. You're allowed to be the Communist Party again, but you're going to do it with our oversight. And it's particularly wild to look at that history. And I don't doubt, I mean, Gus Hall really was very much a communist in his heart and soul. He believed in what he was doing. And, he made a contribution as a leader of the labor movement, and then as someone who campaigned for peace and for civil rights. And they were doing the best they could. That doesn't mean they're all bad people, but yes, they were effectively neutered by the FBI from about 1948 onward. Their existence was at the whim of the Department of Justice.
I remember Gus Hall because I'm old. I remember he ran for president in 1984. And I think that was the last time the Communist Party ran a candidate for president. They always had a candidate for president historically, I think every year, except I think during the Roosevelt years, because they didn't want to oppose Roosevelt. Did they?
They ran somebody. Yeah, they ran Earl Browder in 36.
It was Earl Browder.
Yeah. And, Gus Hall, 1984 was their last presidential campaign. But in 1984, Walter Mondale, I believe that was the candidate, right? Walter Mondale.
Yeah, he was a Democratic candidate. Mm-hmm.
He apparently called Gus Hall on the phone during that campaign. And Gus Hall considered that to be like a huge crowning achievement, that Walter Mondale had called him on the phone during the campaign. They had a short phone call to discuss the possibility of some kind of foreign action with the Soviet Union, impacting the election results. And Gus Hall considered that to be like the highest moment of his career. And he said to his staff, like, this is proof that we are a really, really important part of the peace movement and the effort for, the Democratic camp in the United States against Reagan fascism. And that was their arguments. They argued that Reagan was a fascist, conservative. And even when they did run their own campaigns, they were still campaigning for the Democrats. They would run their candidate, but it was like, we're telling you to vote for the Democrats. It was a recruiting drive. Their campaigns were kind of a recruiting drive, and their speeches that they would give as the campaign would be focused on the Republicans. And they would say, well, the essence of our campaign is to defeat the Republicans. So, they didn't expect to get huge amounts of votes. There were a couple times, though, where 1976, they got a very significant number of votes. And one of the people who voted for them was John Brennan, Obama's CIA director.
That's right. Yes.
So that's wild. Right. And it was probably just because there were a lot of young people that were influenced by the protests and radicalism that wanted to vote. And they saw a communist that's against the establishment and voted for them. Charlene Mitchell, who was their candidate in 1968, I believe she got a significant amount of votes because of the civil rights movement and the Black Panthers being popular and such. And, Angela Davis was a household name, when she was leading the Communist Party, when she was on trial. And then afterwards, she became kind of the primary face of the Communist Party as Gus Hall got older. And Angela Davis, she was an academic who joined them and lost her job at, UCLA for joining them. And was very much kind of their public face throughout the 70s and 80s before resigning.
I remember.
So, yeah, I mean, the Communist Party it's important to know their history. I actually wrote a short book, kind of a history of the Communist Party, just kind of give people an overview.
Just in the United States, the Communist Party USA, right?
Yes. Yeah. And it's a fascinating history. And honestly, I tell people there are only really two communist groups in American history that have ever really mattered. And that's the Communist Party from like the 1930s up into the 1950s when they got crushed, and the Black Panthers. Every other communist group, maybe they did one thing good here or there, but they really didn't make that big of an impact. But the Communist Party and the Black Panthers, they made a significant impact on U.S. society. They got stuff done. And in the 1930s, during the Roosevelt years, the Communist Party, they had 2 city council seats here in New York City. They had 2 members of the House of Representatives that were probably members, Vito Marcantonio, and then there was another guy in Minnesota, I can't remember his name. And the Black Panthers, it's a similar story. They controlled certain neighborhoods around the country. They were loved by the Black community. They ran services and had a lot of influences. So if you want to look at kind of a case study in success, I would urge people, if they study the history of the Communist Party and study the history of the Black Panthers. The other groups are interesting, and they all did something good at one point, or they got something done. But for the most part, they haven't really accomplished that much. But those 2 are the ones to really study.
Well, of course, the point of Strange Bedfellows is sort of opposites attract. I'm not a communist, as you know, I'm a libertarian, but I'm not an anti-communist. I don't hate communism or communists. Unfortunately, too many of my fellow libertarians do. But, I recognize the great strides and the great things that the communists did for American society. I'm not talking about Russia, not talking about China or North Korea. I'm talking about the United States. And certainly in terms of the labor movement in the early to mid 20th century, I'm often telling a lot of my libertarian friends who are anti-communist, I'm like, do you have a job? Yeah. Do you enjoy Labor Day? Do you like your holidays? Yeah. Do you like your 8-hour work day? Yeah. Do you like your benefits package? Yeah. All those things that you have as a laborer, all those protections that you have at your job and your paid holidays and sick leave and all those good things, you can thank a communist for that. Let's be honest, folks.
These auto workers out on strike in Michigan, who built the United Auto Workers? This is a great book here, The Communist Party and the Auto Workers Union by Roger Kieran. It's a very good book about the history of the United Auto Workers. I mean, it was, Homer Martin and Bill McKay and Communist Party members who largely are responsible for unionizing General Motors, Ford, Chrysler. And the Flint sit-down strike of 1937, that people say was like labor's Gettysburg. It was like the turning point for industrial unions in this country. Who were the people occupying the plant? That was Communist Party members, card-carrying communists who did that.
And I also say to my friends who are anti-communist, I'm like, do you like the fact that Black people have rights now, that they can vote? And they say, sure. And I say, well, you can thank a communist for that too.
Yeah.
The civil rights struggle, and part of the reason that J. Edgar Hoover targeted Dr. Martin Luther King was because he was, suspected of being a tool of Russia, of the communists, and that this whole civil rights movement was just a big communist conspiracy, according to Hoover. But, we really do have the communists to thank for that, the civil rights movement. And also, tell us a few things that if you could sit down and talk to an anti-communist, a Republican, a libertarian, what would you tell them to thank a communist for in terms of our society? How did the Communist Party of the United States make our lives better?
Well, I mean, if you're talking specifically about the Communist Party of the United States, any steel worker, any industrial worker, I keep hearing this, that it's a thing I hear. I heard it in Trump's recent speech to the auto workers. I heard it from Steve Bannon many times, is people have it in their heads that jobs in heavy industry are just magically good paying jobs, right? And you hear, well, we need those good jobs to come back because those jobs are just good. And like jobs in fast food or retail, they're just naturally low wage jobs. What people forget is that until the 1950s, really, jobs in steel mills and jobs in auto plants, they tended to not pay very well. And it wasn't until the Communist Party organized them and organized sit-down strikes and occupied the factories and got unions. And then after World War II, they were able to launch the post-World War II strike wave. And amid the post-World War II economic boom, it wasn't until then that industrial workers in the United States got the very comfortable lifestyle that they once had. And so, it's nothing magical about these jobs. And I don't see any reason why fast food workers or retail workers couldn't have that today, but we'd have to have a strong labor movement, right? It's I tell people that there's nothing that we have that we haven't fought for, right? The bosses don't give anything away. Food stamps. I mean, it was the Communist Party during the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, there was no food stamps. People were starving and hungry on the street. And the communists organized these unemployment councils that would go and occupy government buildings and harass elected officials. They organized hunger marches of thousands and thousands of people. Here's something: veterans benefits. Right? Do you know anyone who receives veterans benefits? Well, you can thank the communists for that because they organized something called the Bonus Army. 1932. Yes, thousands and thousands of veterans went to Washington, D.C. and occupied the National Mall demanding the payment of veterans benefits. And that's why
who led that march?
What do you mean?
General Smedley Butler, right?
Yes, indeed. And that there were communists that were involved, and communists, James W. Ford and other communists were heavily involved in making that rally happen. And that, the Communist Party, they are a significant force to be reckoned with. Also, the contribution in terms of art and culture, I think, should be celebrated.
Good point.
Charlie Chaplin was very much a fellow traveler and friend of the Communist Party, a great beloved American filmmaker.
And boy, did he suffer for it. He too was targeted during the Red Scare, and they ran him out of the country.
Yeah, the first play on Broadway advocating LGBT rights was called The Children's Hour, and it was written by Lillian Hellman, who was also viciously targeted during the McCarthy period and blacklisted. But it was a play about two women who run an orphanage, they run an orphanage, and they're gay, and they're basically forced out of the position because people suspect them to be child molesters or something like that. And it just shows how the homophobia kind of destroyed their lives, and that was quite a controversial play back in the 1930s.
It was strange the way that they equated people who were communists with being homosexual. That was always a strange thing about the Cold War I never quite understood.
Well, and actually, it's particularly strange because, Stalin outlawed homosexuality. It was illegal in the Soviet Union. And the Communist Party, officially, their rule was that anyone who was gay was not allowed to be a member. They did not enforce that. They generally didn't enforce that, but that was their position. And until about the 1980s, most communists in the world maintained that homosexuality was a disease from capitalism. They claimed, if you went to the Soviet Union, you asked about gay people, they'd say, we don't have that here. That's from capitalism. We don't have that. You went to Cuba, they would say the same thing. It wasn't until, the 1970s, you started to see the gay rights movement, and East Germany was kind of the beginning of LGBT rights in the communist world. And, now, Cuba has gay marriage, and Fidel Castro actually gave a very heartfelt apology for the mistreatment of gay people in Cuba. It was really significant. And in the early 90s, they made a film. It's a really beautiful Cuban film. I don't know if you ever heard of it, called Strawberry and Chocolate. Do you know this film?
Heard of it. Never seen it.
Well, it came out in the 90s, and it is a Cuban film that it's about an elderly man in Cuba who's an intellectual and kind of a nonconformist, and he's gay, and he befriends a young man who's a very loyal member of the Young Communist League and the Communist Party. And it's about the argument that this very young man and this older gay man have. And eventually the tragedy of the film is that the older gay man ends up defecting from Cuba and leaving. And the message of the film is that Cuban society was not tolerant and not friendly to people like this guy who were intellectually nonconforming or gay, and that it was really sad that Cuba didn't have a place for him. And that film was widely shown, and it won a lot of awards. And that was basically the Cuban government saying, in light of the fall of the Soviet Union, it wasn't just about gay people. It was also about intellectuals. And it was kind of like, the Soviet Union, part of the reason they fell is that they lost a layer of people that were from the more educated layers of their society, and that some of the reforms in Cuba were about kind of maintaining the loyalty of intellectuals and others. And that's a very powerful film. But a big point of the film is that older man is not just an intellectual, not just an educated man. He's also gay, and that, he has to be in the closet about being gay. And so it's very interesting to think about as well. And it's again, I hear both sides, right? I hear that homosexuality is all communist, that the LGBT movement is communist. And I say to people, I hear that from conservatives a lot. And I say to them, they're not into the transgender thing in China. They're not into the transgender and all this stuff that you're mad about. I don't see that happening in communist countries.
Exactly right.
But then I also hear people that are leftists and woke say, well, communist governments murder gay people and persecute them. And I say, whoa. The leader of the first gay rights organization in American history was Harry Hay, who was a Communist Party member. Lillian Hellman, she wrote the first pro-LGBT play on Broadway. And, it was especially, in the 70s and 80s, it was communist organizations that were, pushing the LGBT stuff. So it's complicated. The answer to that question is it's complicated, right? And as you pointed out, I mean, the Red Scare in the United States after the Second World War, people point out it was also the Lavender Scare. And that's when they passed a law that no gay person could work for the State Department because gay people might be communists.
Yes, literally.
And that Joe McCarthy was known to, bully people over allegedly being gay, used nasty language on the floor of
and
Congress.
Yet His
And-
top counsel was Roy Cohn,
right, and
who was
apparently
gay.
he himself may have been gay as well, according to
And the whole David Shine affair apparently was a gay affair.
The whole thing is particularly weird. So it's not one-sided. And that I've noticed that with anti-communism, in a lot of cases, it goes both ways. For conservatives, they have one line. For liberals, they have another line. But the message is the same: hate the communists. And the truth is much more complicated on a lot of these issues. And that's one example. Is the communist movement, is it responsible for all homosexuality and all that? No. Is the communist movement viciously homophobic and hateful? No. It's much more complicated than that.
In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.